Oh, please tell me you're not wargaming Ukraine.
No, I'm just thinking.
That's a lot of paper for a board game.
I'm writing something. Rewriting.
Isn't that the Channel 23 logo? Tell me you're not working for that mad social scientist.
No. A little. She sent me something to look at.
What?
They're considering a news talk show.
Oh, and since she knows things about stuff, she wants your impression.
Things about stuff. They don't have money to hire experts, but I impressed her somehow.
Maybe she thinks you're smart.
I'm not smart, but I do read a lot. I've read a little on the first show's topic.
Which is...
War. What is it good for?
From what we left behind in Afghanistan, absolutely nothing.
Good example. In the script, the hostess talks about how, since the Cold War ended, the US keeps spending more and more on its military and getting less and less for it. This is not exclusive to the US either. It's not good for Russia to expand their war with Ukraine, for example. It wasn't smart for Russia to go in quietly 8 years ago, or openly now, but Putin did it anyway, and he should have known better because he's a smart guy.
Why do you think he's a smart guy?
He's been pretty effective as the leader of the Republican Party.
Oh, nice one.
Thank you. Seriously, though, he's smart enough to realize that if Ukraine democratizes and joins the European Union, he'll have a successful Slavic democracy on his border. He can't have the Russian people thinking democracy is a practical alternative to his rule.
And didn't he blame Western alliances for pushing east?
In that rambling speech of his, yes, he blamed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but as an afterthought. Mostly, he ranted about how Ukraine wasn't a real country and should be part of Russia. You know, there was a time I thought NATO should have disbanded at the end of the Cold War, but I realized later I could think something like that because I live in America, not in Central Europe. If NATO had disbanded, another alliance would have arisen in its place.
Why do you say that?
In Central Europe, there are Poles and Finns and Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians and Czechs and Slovaks and Hungarians and Romanians alive today who have childhood memories of Soviet tanks in their streets. Their fear of Russian aggression isn't some bygone anachronism. NATO may look like a colonizer's club, but it expanded eastward because countries asked to join. If there hadn't been a NATO, someone would have taken the initiative to build a new alliance, and Putin would have blamed his actions on their existence.
He wants war, then.
He wants war. And for a smart guy, that's pretty dumb. War may have been productive, even necessary for human societies in the past, but it's utterly useless now.
I doubt that war was ever a good thing.
It's not. Don't get me wrong. War has always been immoral because it always leads to atrocities. But sometimes it's been the least bad option from a whole menu of bad options.
Like the beef and broccoli at Panda Express.
Precisely. Plus, it's not a comfortable thing to contemplate, but for most of human history, going to war paid dividends. It often made the difference between a culture's survival and its extinction.
I can see people going to war to fight for their survival, but I don't ever see it as productive.
Well, suppose you've got a country. How do you make it richer?
Oh, I did this when we played Civilization. You built farms, factories, and mines.
That's not wrong, but it's not as right as we might hope. China and Rome both built large multi-ethnic empires. They both put a lot into their economic infrastructures as well, but that's not what made them prosperous. Conquest made them prosperous.
I thought they were just being dicks.
There was a certain amount of dickery involved, yes, but in the pre-industrial world, if you wanted to be the leader of a rich and powerful society, conquest paid better dividends than infrastructure investment. Richard Saller of Stanford University has written about the economy of the Roman Empire. He estimates that worker productivity went up about 25% in 3 centuries. In those same 3 centuries, the economy of the empire expanded more than tenfold because of all the people and land added to the empire by conquest.
Oh, so it paid to be a dick.
Only if you had wealth and power. If not, trade and diplomacy were better. But if you were powerful, you got more bang for the buck by spending money on a conquering army than by spending it on farms, mines, and roads.
Yeah, but the Romans were overrun by barbarians.
More precisely, the Goths. By the 4th century, Rome was unable to sustain the costs of protecting its lands. Meanwhile, the Goths were losing their lands to the Huns, so they turned to Rome for protection. The Romans let them into the empire and then treated them like garbage.
Never smart to treat a barbarian badly.
Very true.
What is that, ham? Mind if I have some?
Go ahead.
Some cheese?
Please do.
See, you always treat barbarians well. You gonna finish that champagne?
Help yourself.
Awesome.
Anyway, the Goths revolted, dealt a crushing blow to Rome, and eventually won a peace that allowed them to remain together as a unified people within the borders of the empire. The empire split into western and eastern halves a little later. The east was sufficiently urbanized that taxes could pay for defenses and they could buy off the Goths. The west, however, was more rural, harder to tax and harder to fund. It could not afford to pay its own way, so when the Goths gave it a kick, the whole thing caved in.
Rome splitting. Was that like a national divorce?
What?
Something that Georgia idiot said, remember?
Oh yes, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Twitter banned her as a public health hazard.
Yeah. But right before that, she proposed breaking up the United States. National divorce, she called it.
I never thought of it like that, but maybe. The rural West couldn't survive without the urban East, and we see today that rural areas, the Trumpiest areas, can't survive without blue state subsidies. But no, the circumstances are too different. It wasn't a divorce so much as a life-saving amputation. The separation allowed the East to regroup and survive. But in the West, the Goths and the Franks and the Vandals created prosperous kingdoms not by building infrastructure, but by conquering Roman lands. In the Middle Ages, a lot of wealthy kings became wealthier by conquering their neighbors. By the time you get to the modern era, the only societies that are rich and powerful are militarized ones.
So, medieval rulers were dicks because it paid to be a dick.
Yes, being a dick paid off until the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, infrastructure isn't additive, it's multiplicative. Industrialization makes military action more destructive. As a result, the act of conquering land makes that land less valuable. Sometime in the 19th century, it became more profitable to stay home and build infrastructure than to conquer land and have to rebuild everything.
Is that why there aren't as many wars of conquest these days?
There was Iraq and Kuwait, and these days Russia and Ukraine. Wars are still fought for a lot of reasons, but you're right, conquest is pretty uncommon. Clausewitz said that war is just another type of politics, and that's not wrong. But it's now bad politics. Societies, nations, states that survived into the modern era thanks to their militarism are now being hurt by that militarism. The side that starts wars often can't end them on anything approaching favorable terms. War is not useful anymore. That's what I think should be conveyed in the Network 23 show.
Okay, so whose show is this? Farewell Numinal Observation and Research Directorate?
Produced by, the show is below.
Oh, Stabb in the Dark. Hosted by Wilhelmina Stabb. Who the hell's Wilhelmina Stabb?
They haven't cast her yet.
A fictional character is going to host a news show?
Yes. Apparently she'll be a little dark, a little gothy. I approve.
Hello, darlings. This reads like Elvira hosting a news show. This'll never work.
I think it could work. Let me read it to you. Hello, darlings. I'm your hostess, Wilhelmina Stabb, the news girl who put the vamp in vampire. Welcome to Stabb in the Dark, the news show where we ask, is it worth getting off the floor for this? You know what I'm talking about. Sometimes when I wake up, I'm so depressed I don't even want to get out of my coffin. And I'm lucky to even have a coffin. I got thrown out of that funeral home. They told me to go somewhere else to shop for furniture.
Please skip the monologue. The jokes are terrible.
Okay. Tonight's topic is war. War, war, war. We just can't get enough of it. And by we, I mean us. Humanity. I mean, look at us. We used to be tribal hunter-gatherers. Different tribes could coexist when times were good, but when times got tough, they had to fight to survive. That favored the tribes with the best warriors. Warriors became kings, and kings would fight for land, because when society is agricultural, land is wealth, and wealth is always security, even if you're insecure. So kings wanted more land to keep them wealthy and powerful. They used military power to defend their kingdoms and acquire new ones, regardless of what the people in those lands wanted. Historically speaking, nothing was worse for ordinary people than a crowned head that wanted another crown. The early modern era saw spectacularly bloody wars. Civil war within the Holy Roman Empire cut the population of some parts of Germany in half, and believe me, you do not want your parts cut in half. These wars ended in a series of treaties we call the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. After Westphalia, sovereignty within one's own borders without outside intervention increasingly became a feature of international relations. The modern international order is frequently referred to as the Westphalian system. This system isn't particularly insightful, or moral, or just. It's an accommodation with reality that encourages self-restraint. War is still very much a feature of the international system, but the reasons are different. Nationalism, imperialism, and colonialism came to replace dynastic and religious struggles as casus belli. And if you didn't know, casus belli is Latin for I want your stuff. Nation-states had certain advantages in an environment of competitive militarism. Strong states could impose their will. Weak states very much depended on the goodwill of powerful ones, kind of like how my fate as hostess of this show depends on people liking and subscribing. Through colonial wars and the occasional European war, the nation-state became humankind's most efficient mechanism for managing large-scale violence, at least until professional sports came along. War made modern nation-states very rich, but with the Industrial Revolution it became possible to increase domestic affluence without going to war. In fact, given how easily wars get out of control these days, staying home and building one's infrastructure is by far the better move. Which is great because I like staying home. I've enjoyed the crap out of this pandemic. However, it's hard to unlearn the habit of war when, until recently, it's kept the societies which practice it intact. A survival strategy honed over the centuries is, today, harmful. Our cultures haven't adjusted to that, especially cultures where violence is an accepted part of life, like American culture. The United States has as violent a history as any European country. The extent of that violence is somewhat disguised by the fact that most American violence has been directed against substantially weaker targets, native tribes, and small countries. In the 20th century, America fought big wars against the Central Powers and the Axis, and beat them. But in the 1960s, America got involved in a little war in Vietnam, and got stuck. Vietnam, of course, was a complicated war. It was a French colony when Japan occupied it in 1941. Vietnamese nationalists rose in resistance to the Japanese. After the Japanese were kicked out, the Vietnamese resisted the returning French and defeated them. This victory left Vietnam divided between North and South. The North was controlled by Vietnamese nationalists, a majority of whom were communists. The South was controlled by anti-communist elites backed by the United States. A promised election was never held because the United States and the Vietnamese in the South suspected that the communists would win. The broken promise led to a civil war between North and South. Both sides were racked with political instability, which by 1960 led both governments to embrace authoritarianism. As these two dictatorships faced off against each other, the fact that the North was a single-party communist state brought Cold War considerations into play. The United States and allies intervened ostensibly to prevent the further spread of communism in Asia. These days, the Vietnam War is seen as a quagmire, in which the Pentagon, ignorant of the culture and history of Vietnam, drafted good men from American streets and dumped them into an unwinnable war. Unfortunately, that perception is largely correct. The Pentagon's own review of the war was leaked to the press in 1971 as the Pentagon Papers. The papers showed that the war was being fought less to contain communism and more to avoid an embarrassing defeat. That is, the United States was fighting not to win, but to put off losing. Leslie Gelb, the director of the internal Pentagon project that produced the papers, said in a 2018 interview that the main lesson was not the lies, it was the staggering ignorance at all levels of the American government regarding the cultures and histories of Vietnam and the wider region. Basically, we lost because we couldn't bother to open a book. To get out of Vietnam, American soldiers trained Vietnamese soldiers. In 1973, America declared peace with honor and brought the troops home. North Vietnam resumed attacks less than a year later. The South was unable to resist and surrendered in 1975.
All those people were killed because nobody studied.
Oh, people studied, but no one wanted to listen to experts. They were too busy freaking out about communism.
That seems so stupid now.
There were a lot of stupid decisions made in the Cold War. The dominant type of communism then was very authoritarian. The West was capitalist, but also democratic to varying degrees. Any socialist or communist movement was automatically assumed to be hostile to democracy, regardless of whether or not it was.
Reminds me of Republicans screaming about socialism every time the government tries to fix something.
That was pretty much the Cold War. If the people of a developing country elected a socialist government to fix things, the Western democracies would overthrow it, undermine it, destroy it. More than once, a budding democracy was replaced with a brutal dictatorship, often at the behest of corporations that stood to lose something. Oil companies in Iran, mining companies in Chile, fruit companies in Guatemala. They all played parts in destroying democracy in those countries.
Fruit companies destroyed democracy in Guatemala. That blows my mind.
Where was I? Oh yes. The Soviet War in Afghanistan is often called the Soviet Vietnam. Afghanistan had a history of tribalism without a strong central government. In 1978, a Marxist government centralized authority in the country, which triggered a civil war. It was into this civil war, with little concern for Afghan history and tradition, that the Soviet Union sent its soldiers. Like the Americans with Vietnam, they should have studied. Because the Soviets had intervened directly, Cold War considerations came into play. Anti-government forces, the Mujahideen, received support from the United States. The Mujahideen didn't like America much more than they liked the USSR, but American weapons they liked. Despite Soviet intervention, the government never controlled much of the country. In 1985, the Soviets began planning a withdrawal, building up the local army to continue the fight in its place. This strategy really had no other purpose than to give the Soviets an excuse to abandon the country without admitting defeat. With the Soviets out of the way, a new phase of civil war opened up as the Mujahideen began fighting each other. One group, united by common ethnicity and religious fundamentalism, emerged as the strongest and took control of most of the country in 1996. This group, the Taliban, established a brutal religious dictatorship. How brutal? They banned culture, music, recreation, games, movies, television, and they banned women. Well, they couldn't ban women, but they settled for house arrest. Women were not allowed to leave their homes except in the company of male relatives. Living in a country dominated by religious fanatics who hate culture and women? I can't even imagine. Yes, I can. Anyway, moving on. In 1990, Iraq conquered and annexed Kuwait. The United States assembled a coalition to kick the Iraqis back out again. Unlike Vietnam, the media were kept on a tight leash. In exchange, they got great pictures. Spectacular footage dazzled the press, and they broadcast it uncritically to the world. I don't have to tell you that the media loves war. Even before photography and video, the media loved war, whether in news or in entertainment. Actually, that's true of the same thing, isn't it? Anyway, whether in fact or in fiction, conflict generates interest, and the easiest type of conflict to understand is violence. And if it comes with pictures of things we don't often see in our daily lives, like explosions, that's even better. So news programs like to show us dramatic footage of things going boom. I call it warnography. The Gulf War generated a lot of warnography. US President George H.W. N.F.T. Bush was smart enough not to occupy Iraq, but in his overconfidence, he announced that America had kicked the Vietnam Syndrome. Thing is, Bush did not understand what the Vietnam Syndrome was. He thought it was a national sense of failure and powerlessness. In reality, it was and is the uncritical pursuit of foreign wars that make no sense and cannot be won. Even though the Gulf War had limited, achievable goals, its success resurrected the idea that war of any kind could be useful. This became very obvious when George's dim and incurious son, George, carelessly allowed the September 11th attacks on the United States to take place. Now, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theory kind of girl. By allowed, I mean he had warning, but he did nothing. The result was successful terrorist attacks on New York and the Pentagon, and a thwarted attack on Washington, possibly aimed at the Capitol building. It would take another 20 years before terrorists successfully attacked the Capitol. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, the United States and allies occupied Afghanistan with the goal of capturing the leaders of the terror organization behind the attacks. Little George soon lost interest, and those leaders escaped. In spring 2002, the mission changed from counterterrorism to nation-building. Behind the scenes, the focus shifted to Iraq. The actual job of Americans serving in Afghanistan was to avoid defeat. Removing the Iraqi leadership had been part of Little George's campaign platform, and he was determined to follow through. Domestically, most congressional Democrats voted against war with Iraq. Worldwide, millions of protesters marched against the impending war.
I remember those marches. I remember people calling them dirty hippies.
The hippies were right to be there, but there were plenty of plain old suburbanites in those marches. Office workers, soccer moms.
The ones that weren't called hippies were called wimps.
I recall that. Wimps. Or the ultimate insult, women.
Bastards. They're too wimpy to stand up to this woman.
Yeah, the entire pro-war response to the demonstrations was, "Come on, are you chicken or what?" Which is weird because war is the path of the weak.
Well, that sounds like a man to me. Actually, they do that today, too.
Yes, they do, because in our culture we've basically gendered our foreign policy. Diplomacy is feminine, war is masculine.
That's bullshit.
No, it's true. War is all about domination and displays of strength. It's boys fighting in the playground. Diplomacy requires patience, tact, a willingness to listen, like the mothers of those fighting boys. But since we value masculinity over femininity, diplomacy gets little respect.
Then we should let women handle negotiations. Men are too emotionally unstable.
No kidding. Something else. Like it said in the script, war is a conflict that is easy to understand. It's easier to sell in the media. Diplomacy is complicated, with a lot of moving parts and a lot of things happening behind the scenes. Not as interesting for the political press. It doesn't drive up ratings like war does.
Oh, crap. You might be right. I'll have to think about that.
Please do. There's something more about the media in this script as it happens. Let me continue. Now remember, the media loves them some war. American news programs minimized coverage of the protests, even though they were among the largest anti-war demonstrations ever. Little George had a hard time selling the Second Iraq War not only domestically, but to the rest of the world. The British were persuaded to join, but most of America's traditional allies wanted no part of it. In the short term, the war was a success. The Iraqi government was toppled and the country occupied. Curated coverage ensured that the media got great pictures of things going boom. However, foreign occupation gave rise to resistance, and the power vacuum that resulted from the fall of Iraq's dictator triggered a civil war. Anyone who knew anything about Iraq could have warned Little George this would happen, and in fact, several people did. As in Afghanistan, the regime change mission became a nation-building mission. As in Afghanistan, American soldiers were deployed in the middle of another country's civil war. In both countries, as in Vietnam, the American government began searching for a way out without admitting defeat. They started by searching for ways to move other soldiers into combat and keep American casualties low. As in Vietnam, they used hastily trained local soldiers as meat shields. Unlike Vietnam, the United States also relied heavily on mercenaries. Most mercenaries, like the soldiers, were there to do a very difficult job in very trying circumstances. Trouble is, no one really knew what that job was or who the enemy was. Ordinary Iraqis became targets. After one too many atrocities, the new Iraqi coalition government lost patience with the American occupation and secured American withdrawal in 2011. With regard to Afghanistan, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, interviewed a number of high-ranking officials involved with decision-making there. The compiled interviews came to light in 2019 as the Afghanistan Papers. What did the Afghanistan Papers reveal? Exactly what the Pentagon Papers revealed about Vietnam. The American government knew the war could not be won, and deliberately misled the public about the aims and status of the war. In 2021, US President Joe Biden did something that presidents find hard to do. He ended a war, the war in Afghanistan. This made the political press angry. Even though the foreign policy establishment was wrong about the war, and had been caught lying about the war, major media outlets have almost exclusively featured discussions and interviews with supporters of the war and opponents of withdrawal. The press seems determined to punish Biden for this. Since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, even good news is presented negatively, driving Biden's approval ratings down. They will never forgive him for taking away their beloved war. Not because they lost pictures of things going boom, they hardly covered Afghanistan at all in the last 5 years, but because it is unforgivable to be right when everybody else is wrong. The meritocracy at work, folks. So, given that starting wars is such a bad idea, what is behind Putin's obsession with Ukraine? Is he worried about the Russian minority facing discrimination? Is he worried about Ukraine joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the alliance that stood against and outlived the Soviet Union? Does he want to recreate the Russian or Soviet Empire by annexing Ukraine? Only Putin knows the real reasons. I'm sure he wants a regime change, but Russian troops have been in Ukraine since 2014. The best outcome for Russia was, and remains, a short military escalation to destabilize Ukraine and force them into a Soviet-style friendship and cooperation treaty, making them a Russian satellite. But could a Ukrainian government that signs such a treaty survive without Russian military support? Civil resistance opens the door to long-term military occupation. Putin knows it could become the quagmire that topples him. So I can't say how far this escalation will go. For all I know, I'm going to walk out of the studio after taping this and find a major war has begun. But Vladimir Putin is a smart man. All he needs to do to take control of Ukraine is find a corrupt, brainless conman, prop him up with illicit loans, and get him to run for president while unleashing a disinformation campaign that makes his opponent look like they're bad at email server management. It's worked before. Anyway, that's our show. Thanks for coming. Please comment. I love to hear from you, dears. What do you think will happen in Ukraine? Answers on a postcard, please, to...
That's a lame way to end a show.
Yes, the ending probably needs work. This is as much as I've been able to do so far.
It really does sound like your kind of show. They should cast you.
As Wilhelmina Stabb? I'm not young, I'm not pretty, and I still haven't healed from the Blanchard incident.
You are so full of excuses.
That's not what I thought you'd say I was full of.
No, I hope you enjoy writing for them. I'm sure whatever they're paying you, it's not enough. They are paying you, right?
I forgot to ask for money.
How can someone so smart be so dumb?
Answers on a postcard, please, to...
That's it! I'm out.